in cultural psychology, it talks a lot about what are the cultural differences between different groups in the world. What Joe's now trying to do is say, well, okay, it's well enough to point out what the differences are. Let's explain where they came from. And so his new book is about how the West got weird, which is his acronym for Western, which is tautological, but Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And so he's saying, okay, well, how did those differences happen? So how did the West get weird? And he points a lot to the innovations that Christianity made on the world, and not even just all of Christianity. So Catholicism, right? So one of the big things that he's talked about, which I found really interesting, this is based on ideas initially proposed by Jack Goody, who was an anthropologist, and they've been recently analyzed in this great working paper by this economist named Benjamin Enke at Harvard, where they look at how Christianity dissolved existing complex kinship structures. So before this process of dissolution, humans had organized themselves in terms of initially small bands of kin and then larger bands of kin, but they were complex groups, and there was a lot of cousin marriage, so there was a lot of keeping things within the family. And when you keep things within the family, that's good for cooperating with the family, but it's not good for cooperating beyond that complex kinship group, right? It's not good for trusting people outside of that kin. You literally keep it in the family. And so Goody and Henrik make the point that Catholicism explicitly tried to dissolve these kinship bands by doing things like they banned cousin marriage, or what they did is they banned it, but they did so by saying that, well, cousin marriage is incest. Humans have an evolved genetic incest aversion, which is the incest aversion that you have for having sex with your sibling. We don't need cultural norms to convince people not to have sex with their siblings. We just don't do it. However, we do need cultural norms to get people to not have sex with their cousins. And usually the reason that people think about this is, well, if you have sex with your cousin, it's going to increase the threat of genetic deformities in the next generation. And it does, but it does only to a small degree. The risk of a genetic deformity, if you're having sex with if you're reproducing with your first cousin, is about the same as if you're a woman having a kid above 40. And so if that was the reason, well, then we should ban, geriatric pregnancies as well, which we obviously don't do. And so what this argument is that, well, there was a different reason for it, right? So it was culturally adaptive to dissolve these cousin marriages and other regulations that allowed for the dissolution of these complex kinship groups, so that people would allow their trust and cooperation to spread beyond the in-group into larger and larger bands.
And so what was the thinking? What's the argument about the thinking there on the part of the Catholic Church?
I don't know whether it was done with foresight.
Or if it could have just been something that happened for political reason, and lo and behold,
it turned out to be a fantastic idea.
Right, cascading positive effects.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. Because it didn't happen in the Eastern Church, in the Orthodox Church.
Oh,
interesting. It just seemed to happen in Catholicism. And so Henrik and Enke do these really fascinating analyses which show that the time since so you see those rules spread to different parts of Europe and then different parts of the world at different times. And the time since that happened corresponds to measures of individualism. So the longer ago it happened, the more individualistic that society is. And with that individualism comes a greater trust for people outside your immediate group. So what you find is that the kinship tightness is predictive of trust for people within your neighborhood, is positively predicted for that. So the tighter the kinship groups, the more these cousin marriage systems still exist, the more you trust people in your neighborhood, but the less you trust everybody outside of that. And so
for the very reasons I guess you were discussing earlier about just our innate predisposition to suspecting those who we regard as not within our in-group.
That's right. So it's very natural from the genetic standpoint to favor the immediate in-group and to fear the out-group beyond that small kinship group. So it's very natural for us to do that. It doesn't necessarily mean it's good for what we're trying to achieve. And it seems like the more you dissolve that, and the more you spread trust beyond a larger group, the richer your society can become. The more productive it can become, the more cooperation can emerge between a larger group of people, which allows for the spread of trade, allows for collective government, it allows for larger groups, which ultimately ended up being more successful.
Right.
And you can extrapolate that further. You can say, well, it's not just kinship groups, now it's ethnic groups, right? So if you spread beyond just ethnic groups and you can actually incorporate more ethnicities and maintain a level of trust, and that's a hard thing to do, but you're better off as a result.